Good old Southern church revivals. I know you've heard of, or at least been to at least one. A week-long event filled with preaching, singing, praying, traveling preachers, guest speakers, and the best local gospel bands anyone can find. The Holy Spirit moves through the community, and the week ends with souls being brought to God, baptisms, and the occasional human sacrifice. Wait, what? It seems Kentucky does theirs a little bit differently. Everyone loves a good, strange, weird, or bizarre story. Well, welcome to the American South, where dark legends and haunted history lurk around every corner. Where superstition, folklore, and a touch of backwoods magic blend with everyday culture. Some say, in order to survive. This is Dixie After Dark. Tomahawk is a tiny, unincorporated community in Martin County, Kentucky. The community has an estimated population of only 1,000. It has no schools, since the only one it had was closed in 2002 and converted to a furniture store. The town's most well-known landmark is an old post office that has been closed since 2012. The town does boast a volunteer fire department, one used car lot, and 3 churches. It seems to be a place that if you blink while driving by, you'll miss the entire town. Seems to have always been that way. But in 1933, an event happened that put Tomahawk, Kentucky on the front page of newspapers across the entire country. The Mills family was a large family with deep roots in the region. They were also a very religious family, as most were in that area at the time. But it was when a Pentecostal preacher by the name of Reverend Duty brought a revival to the area. A small group within the Mills family became enthralled with the style of worship that focused on baptism in the Holy Spirit, something that becomes evident by allegedly speaking in tongues, prophesying, healing, and exorcisms. Hungry for more, 36-year-old John Mills stuck close to Reverend Duty and began even preaching himself, all the while building a small following of family members. The group took to the home church route of holding worships in individual homes in the community rather than having their own dedicated building. John Mills named his new church the Cult of the Unknown Tongues. Yep, you heard that right. The Cult of the Unknown Tongues. Neighbors reported that John and his followers gathered pretty often. They would sing and pray in circles, over and over, until they received what they called their blessing, an eruption of shouting and screaming in what they called the unknown tongue. Most described it as a mix of grunts and sounds of this, that, and the other. But to the followers, it was their language of prayer. Of course, even the followers didn't understand the language, but they said they didn't have to. They trusted their leader, John Mills. John would let them know what they said and further guide them with visions and messages from God that he claimed to receive, personally. The home church meetings continued for around a year, and some of the Mills kinfolk believed what John Mills was teaching. But other kinfolk started to get a bit uncomfortable with things, especially when some followers started making claims of being able to perform miracles, mostly consisting of turning water into wine and turning grapevines into snakes. These claims, along with not being able to perform those same miracles upon request, caused some of the relatives to back away from any further worship services. Still, though, the core continued on with their meetings, unswayed by what they called the unbelievers. In early February of 1933, John Mills, out of the blue, started an impromptu revival of his own. The group did their usual services, moving from home to home, but this time daily. It was said that, along with their usual dancing and praying, the group instituted a week-long fast with the revival, a time of not eating. By February 8th, things had begun to shift. As strange and unusual as these gatherings were to those outside of the cult of the unknown tongues, things seemed more strange this time than they normally did. Locals started expressing concern about the shouting coming from the cabin the cult was now gathered in. Inside the cabin was 72-year-old Lucinda Mills, the matriarch of the Mills family. Also, her daughter Talitha and husband Tommy Boyd, the owners of the cabin. There was also Lucinda's son, 34-year-old Fred Mills, and wife Trixie. Lucinda's 25-year-old grandson, Ballard Mills. Her daughter Molly McGinnis and husband Blaine. Another daughter, Ora Moore, and of course, Lucinda's oldest son, 36-year-old John Mills, and his wife Alma. As far as the others within the community, it was one of Lucinda's daughter-in-laws, Rhoda Mills, who initially raised the most concern. Though the small community had started worried murmurs about the gathering, Rhoda Mills initially went to the cabin out of concern for the children inside. She had heard about the group's fasting and was worried that the children were being forced into the week without food as well. Rhoda decided that she would go get the children and take them home to her house to feed them. Upon arriving at the Boyd cabin, though, Rhoda claimed she was overcome with fear over what she heard. She peeked through a window and saw the group dancing wildly with their hands in the air. Then someone yelled, "Let's crucify her." Rhoda then claimed that Ballard Mills noticed her looking through the window and screamed at her. Rhoda then took off running to another one of Lucinda's other sons' cabin to get help. There, they called the sheriff's department. When deputies arrived at the Boyd cabin, a flood of screaming and shouting could be heard from inside, so the deputies broke down the door, believing someone could be in danger. There, they found John Mills, sitting on top of his mother, Lucinda. John's knees were in Lucinda's chest, and he was pulling at chains that were wrapped around Lucinda's neck. The deputies immediately tried to get John off of his mother, and reported that as they did so, John repeatedly yelled, "Have your way, Lord, have your way." Deputies did their best to sort through the chaos as John Mills and the group then burst into their unknown tongues. John Mills fought back against the deputies as they tried to remove him from atop his mother. All the while, the other worshippers simply stood there, yelling in their unknown tongue. The deputies were ultimately able to subdue John, and that's when the rest of the group tried to help. And by help, I mean help John. Deputy Rafe Mollett had to threaten Blaine McGinnis with his gun to get him back away as they tried to check Lucinda for any signs of life. Ballard Mills came at a deputy with a knife, causing that deputy to pull his own weapon. Ballard did drop the knife when ordered, but the deputies went on to report officially that everyone was, quote, like raving, crazy, drunk people. It took some doing, but the deputies were able to get everyone outside and somewhat under control. That's when one of the women members, who wasn't identified by name in the police reports, said it was hard to give Mother up, but she wanted to go to the asylum to cast the devils out. There were still children inside the cabin, but deputies report that they were shut in a separate room, away from where Lucinda died. The children were ushered away to safety as 8 of Lucinda Mills' relatives were taken into custody. Later that day, Rhoda Mills returned to the cabin with a group of neighbors to prepare Lucinda's body for burial. Rhoda reported that as they moved Lucinda from the floor to a bed, she noticed more chains around Lucinda's ankles. She also reports that Lucinda's neck must have been broken because it was, quote, ever so limber. The members of the Mills family that were taken into custody were transported to Martin County Jail in Inez, Kentucky. Everyone was placed in the same cell, except John. John Mills was still being very violent. It's said that he even attacked one of the jailers. John Mills was placed in a cell alone and chained to the cell bars for his own protection, as well as protection for others that may need to enter the cell for whatever reason. John refused to talk. As deputies put it, John Mills simply fell into a stupor. In the other cell, the cult of the unknown tongues continued to pray and sing, and from reports, they did this for hours. Eventually, though, reality began to set in on a few of them, and one by one, they agreed to talk to deputies. It was then that the church members decided to throw John Mills under the bus. They said John Mills had loosed evil spirits among them. When pressed further, the family began telling things that gave a good outline of how John's mind had become twisted and corrupted with power. The family told police that John Mills had received a message from God to carry out a burnt offering, much like the biblical story of Abraham. God instructed Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a burnt offering, only to stop Abraham when he neared completion, stating it was a test of faith. John Mills had latched onto the idea of a burnt offering, but he believed, as others said, that choking the life out of someone proved power over death, and that should be done first. John's belief, or what he told his followers anyway, was that once his mother Lucinda was dead and burned on the altar, she would be resurrected 3 days later. He'd convinced everyone, including himself, that the sacrifice had to happen, and all the prayer, fasting, and speaking in tongues had prepared them for that act. The other family members sitting in jail had started to process what they witnessed and participated in, and the fact that Lucinda Mills would not be resurrected after all. Whether they believe this now because of coming to know the truth, or they believe this now because the ritual was never completed, never became apparent. County Attorney Jasper Priest convinced Talitha Boyd to finally talk. Talitha states her and Tommy Boyd were at home around 11 a.m. when they heard shouting. She looked out the window and saw John Mills approaching, carrying a large stick in one hand, his Bible in the other. He was walking along with his eyes shut. Ballard Mills was walking beside John, also carrying a stick, and eyes closed. She knew their eyes were shut by the way they were stumbling along. Behind them were John's wife Alma, John's brother Fred Mills, and his wife Trixie, followed also by a small group of children. They all made their way to the Boyd cabin and immediately erupted into prayers and shouts. Talitha states John directed the group to start beating each other with their Bibles to drive out the devil. And so it began. Some of the children were so scared that they ran from the cabin. Talitha gathered up the ones that stayed and ushered them to a separate room and shut the door. After locking the main cabin door, John Mills announced he was going to drive the devils out of their mother. Lucinda Mills was already there, resting in the bedroom after dealing with a headache. John forced Lucinda to come out and lie down on the floor, or what John Mills called the altar. John began waving his hands over her and speaking in the unknown tongue, and Talitha said other family members joined in. Then, out of the blue, John Mills put his hands around Lucinda's throat and started choking her. He then knelt on her chest, choking her with one hand, beating her with the other. Talitha states that Lucinda tried to get away, but John was too strong. The others in the room, according to Talitha, were compelled by some spirit that made them unable to move to save Lucinda. She then confirmed the stories that John Mills planned to burn Lucinda as an offering, and that she would be resurrected. Blaine McGinnis, Lucinda's son-in-law, also opened up to authorities. He claimed that he tried to grab John and stop him, but he couldn't. Not that John overpowered him, but that Blaine literally felt as if he couldn't move. As he stood there, frozen, John Mills ordered Ballard to bring him the chains. It was not long after when the police broke into the cabin. The following day, as Lucinda Mills was laid to rest, Judge T.J. Harden held an inquest, and the verdict was Lucinda died at the hands of her son and others. Attorney Priest immediately moved to charge John Mills with murder, and the others as accessories. When arraigned 4 days later, it said John Mills was still in a stupor, unable or unwilling to speak. He was brought into the courtroom tied to a cot. When asked to answer to the charges that he killed his own mother, John began shouting in his unknown tongue. The 6 others being held as accessories to the crime were a little more willing to talk in English, so they were called to testify. In court, Blaine McGinnis made the shocking claim that Lucinda was a willing sacrifice, that she was a woman of faith and she volunteered to help her son Leonard. Leonard Mills had been institutionalized at the Eastern Kentucky Hospital for the Insane and was said to be of a very religious temperament. You don't say. Blaine said he heard his mother-in-law making statements about willingly giving her life to save Leonard's. Suddenly, the statement made during the arrest of she wanted to go to the asylum to cast the devils out of them made sense. Well, maybe only a little sense. Okay, it made no sense, but at least it was consistent. It's rumored that in the months before Lucinda's death, some family members had questioned whether John Mills should be institutionalized as well, and that John had heard these mumblings. I wonder if this made him cast doubt over his own mental state, and that added to the belief that a burnt offering would offer healing for Leonard, and possibly himself. County Attorney Priest said that John Mills' neighbors and many family members who had been present at earlier religious gatherings had long been worried about John's growing violent nature. They also said that John had mentioned several names that had been revealed to him as sacrifices. Blaine McGinnis confirmed in court, saying that John named at least 4 people he planned to sacrifice. In addition to Lucinda, The others were John's own brother Fred, Fred's wife Trixie, and John's religious mentor, Reverend Duty. Trixie Mills confirmed in court that before John went after Lucinda, he had forced Trixie to the floor and started choking her, but she was able to free herself. Trixie also stated that in the weeks before, Lucinda had been warning John that he was going too far with his teachings. Locals had also told Attorney Priest that there had been some sort of disagreement between John Mills and his brother Fred. In the prosecution's mind, those named to be sacrificed seemed to all have stood up to John in some way or another. And as far as Reverend Duty, investigators learned that a week before Lucinda's death, John and Duty had argued over who should be leading their religious group. So John beat him pretty badly. In Attorney Priest's mind, John Mills must be held over to face murder charges. If not, others would no doubt be in danger. Luckily, the judge agreed, and John was held without bail until the next grand jury session in April. Naturally, the defense entered a plea of temporary insanity for both John and those charged as accessories. The defense said they would prove that John and his followers suffered from, quote, a temporary imbalance brought on by the days of fasting. By April 9th, the trial was underway. Immediately, the judge freed Fred Mills and Tommy Boyd over weaknesses of the state's cases against them. The rest of them would be tried over the next 2 days. Defense counsel relied on the testimony of 2 doctors from the Eastern State Hospital for the Insane. They evaluated all of the defendants and testified that John Mills was insane at the time of the murder. They added that John had no concept of right and wrong. They also agreed the remaining defendants had been bound up with so much emotion and were so determined to believe John's teaching that they were not responsible for their actions, or lack thereof. They ended their testimony with, quote, the slaying of Lucinda Mills was as black and horrible of a crime as the Commonwealth has pictured, but John Mills was stark mad at the time, and is stark mad now. Commonwealth attorney J.D. Clark painted a different picture. He told the jury that John Mills was a cold-blooded killer who singled people out that challenged his leadership. The prosecution also brought in doctors that testified that the defendants were in fact sane and that John Mills was faking everything. They also called in witnesses that shared conversations where John Mills spoke of killing people, including his mother, before the gathering at the cabin that day. The witnesses backed up the claims that each person John had singled out had challenged him and his methods previously. When it was all said and done, the jury deliberated for only 12 hours. On April 12, 1933, John Mills was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Ballard Mills and Blaine McGinnis were found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to 21 years. The other defendants were found not guilty. Blaine McGinnis was the only defendant to make a statement, vowing to fight the verdict, and he did. 7 months later, on November 3, 1933, the governor of Kentucky granted Blaine a pardon, saying Blaine McGinnis never intentionally did anything toward the killing of Lucinda Mills, or Ballard, who had retrieved the chains that John had wrapped around his mother's neck. Lucinda Mills rests in an unmarked grave, off in the woods at a small family cemetery. The channel, the Hillbilly Files, Legends and Locations, made their own grave marker and left it in the area as a memorial. I'll link their channel and video for those that are interested. I've come across reports that John Mills never served his entire sentence. Most locals agree, but I haven't been able to find as to when he was released or why. I have little doubt that there was some mental issues involved with this case that were not identified yet in 1933. I'm not saying that's an excuse either, though. I've seen some weird things involving churches in my time, and I hate to say, after doing this research and looking back on everything, I'm not as shocked by this story as I probably should be.